how do people really learn? At a Newspring, we create experiences with leading learning pioneers like Dr. Felipe Hartman, Julie Dirksen, and Lauren Waldman to explore just that and more. Don't miss our next Love to Learn experience, an event series to help and inspire you to create training based on how people learn best. Find out what's coming up at newspring.com/events.
If you're in workplace learning, Learning Technologies 2025 should definitely be on your radar. It's happening 23rd to 24th of April at Excel London, and the scale is huge. 11,000 visitors, 1,000 conference delegates, and a free exhibition with over 200 L&D solution suppliers. The conference theme, People, Technology in the Future, Decision Time, taps into the biggest topics in L&D right now. With 80 expert speakers and 30 sessions, they'll cover AI, skills, personal growth, and practical L&D essentials. Booking opens at the end of January. Check out learningtechnologies.co.uk for more info. Everything changes. Everything's changing all the time. Getting hotter or colder, bigger or smaller, more or less alive. And yet we like to talk about change as if it's something out of the ordinary, an aberration. More than that, we seem to want to believe that the global changes affecting business in our own time are somehow bigger, faster, and nastier than anything that has happened before. Personally, I always thought that last idea was ludicrous. Until now.
Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning.
Learning is fun.
Knowledge is power. Knowledge. Education.
I first came across the acronym VUCA, standing for Volatile, Uncertain, Complex and Ambiguous, more than a decade ago at a knowledge exchange event in London run by Iventive, one of our sponsors for this season. I was also at the most recent of their London events last week, and I felt moved to take a time machine back to that earlier year. I wanted to tell them all there, if you think you're living in a VUCA world now, just wait until 2025. All three of our guests this time were taking part in that Iventive knowledge exchange, Learning Futures London. At times it seemed like the whole event was about change. The changes AI is bringing, how you transform something as resilient and stubborn as company culture, and how you shift the focus on individual performance to team performance in an age of hyper-individualism. It's all about change, and we've got a whole typology now. We talk about disruption, we talk about transformation, changes in the rate of change. It was a great event, and I want to give a personal thanks to Russell Butler, to Richard and Kerry and everybody in the Iventive team, but also to the people who helped us from Shell, who were hosting the event. In this episode, you'll hear interviews with Kevin Oakes, Kim McMurdo, and Terry Jones, thought leaders, all of them. So here's the first of those, an interview with Kevin Oakes. And who he?
Hack Facts.
Kevin Oakes is the CEO and co-founder of the Institute for Corporate Productivity, I4CP, a leading human capital research firm. He authored the Amazon bestseller Cultural Renovation, detailing strategies for successful organizational culture change. Previously, Kevin founded and led Sum Total Systems and Click to Learn. So Kevin, welcome to The Learning Hack.
Thanks, John. Good to be here.
In your book, you talk about culture renovation rather than culture change. You know, people talk a lot about change in learning and HR, but renovation rather than change. What's the difference you're getting at there? Why is renovation the better way to think about transforming organizational culture?
Yeah, it probably makes sense to go back to what we originally researched. So this all came about from a study we did on culture change several years ago, and we were fueled by one particular statistic, and that's that 85% of companies who try to change their culture fail. In fact, only 15% will tell you they had success in changing their culture. And as we embarked on this study, what we were trying to uncover was a blueprint of those companies that succeeded, that we could share with others. Were there commonalities that they embarked on that we could then put into a playbook that other organizations could learn from? And we did find 18 action steps, leadership actions that companies could take in order to effectively change culture. Now, when we went into this, we were using the common term culture transformation. So if you Google that, you'll get millions of hits on culture transformation. As we studied those successful companies, we recognized none of them transformed themselves. They didn't become something completely different. What they did instead was how you would approach an old house. They carefully renovated their companies, keeping what was unique about those organizations to begin with, keeping what was hard to replace, much like you would with an old house, but improving areas, of the organization in order to improve value, again, like you would an old house. So renovation just became a much more approachable term. And I've heard this from many, many people since we published the book, that they love the concept of renovation much more so. It's much less daunting and is something that they can work with. So that's why we chose that term.
Doesn't that kind of run a bit counter to the current culture of start up day one, burn it all down and start again? And
it just doesn't happen. The companies don't just start all again. You can't just shed everything that you've done in the past and begin anew. You always have artifacts that you're carrying with you. And so most companies that are trying to change their culture, take that more of a renovation approach. How can we renovate for future value increase?
So as somebody who's lived in an Edwardian house and had to kind of deal with quite a major extension to the house, it's kind of a matter of what features you want to keep and what you want to sort of let go.
And the way we organize these action steps is using that house metaphor. We put it into 3 stages: plan, build, and maintain. And those are important concepts because a lot of new CEOs or senior management teams, when they want to change culture, they leap right into the build phase, right? They just want to have action quickly, and they're often urged to make changes quickly.
Right.
But like an old house, if you ran in there and just started knocking down walls without a plan, you could take the whole thing down. And I've seen, some leadership take the whole company down by not having a solid plan.
Right.
So we talk a lot about make sure you understand what are the strengths and weaknesses of the culture to begin with. The worst thing an executive team can do is lock themselves in a conference room and decide amongst themselves, what needs to change about the culture and what's strong about the culture today, because they will get it wrong.
Yeah.
You really have to listen to the workforce and do extensive listening sessions to unearth, what is really happening at the ground level within the organization before you can even begin to discuss making changes. And it's the same with the maintain phase. It's a phase that often gets ignored, but many times when a company is trying to change their culture, there's a lot of hoopla and, a lot of activity around changing it. But if you don't do the hard work of continuing to maintain that, it's like the old house. It'll just fall back into disrepair. And what happens in a corporate culture is they fall back to old habits and they fall back to the way they used to do things.
Yeah, which is where the housing metaphor breaks down, because once you've put that 3rd floor in the house, it's there. Yeah.
It's a loose metaphor, John.
Yes, like all metaphors, shouldn't be taken too seriously. So you studied all these organizations, the ones that built resilient, adaptive culture. What are the common traits of the people who got it right? How they got it right?
Yeah, we've studied that pretty extensively. And companies that have very healthy cultures tend to be transparent in general. They share information widely across the organization. There's not a lot of rumors and secrets in the organization. Everybody knows the scorecard. They know if they're performing well or performing poorly, both at the individual level, department level, organizational level. So I think that's one big part of it. I think having a shared purpose and a well-understood purpose, as well as well-understood values and behaviors, is a common thread through healthy cultures. We actually did a study a little while ago that showed companies where employees can't even remember the values, they tend to be low-performance organizations.
Right.
The ones that know the values off the top of their head, they tend to be high-performing organizations. Now, that's a very simple test, but it was amazing how clear the correlation was between toxic cultures and healthy cultures.
So it's a bit like that politician thing of putting your key messages on a credit card and just making sure they're memorable.
Yeah, but also, making sure that all decisions are aligned with the purpose of the organization, the values of the organization, and that the behaviors that are carried out are in line with the values. We often find companies, they've put the values, in a PowerPoint, they've framed it on a wall, but the leaders don't walk the talk, right? The leaders do something very different than the values. And that also is the sign of an unhealthy culture usually. The companies that are healthy tend to reinforce that quite a bit and ensure that leaders' behaviors are always in support of those values.
Yeah. That alignment with values throughout a company can be harder to do than to say, can't it? I mean, I think
Absolutely.
most of my experience in companies is with startups, but even with small companies, we found that we wanted to change the culture of the company by bringing in a Yammer network that everybody could talk to about. But a large proportion of this company were developers, and they weren't going to move away from IRC when they got to Yammer.
Yeah.
And they resisted it tooth and nail. And in the end, the CEO decided, well, they're developers do what they do. We have this bit of the company that functions slightly differently to everybody else. We can't enforce that. We just kind of have to go with it. Does alignment break down when you have to change the change program according to those specificities and slight eccentricities of different parts of the organization? The lawyers don't necessarily think the same way as the accountants and the
Well, there's a common thread amongst these companies that successfully change cultures, and having those detractors is something every organization runs into. And you're going to have detractors, at the lowest levels and even at the highest levels. And so it's important to remove those obstacles, not necessarily take those people out of the organization, although that certainly has happened, but make sure that their opinions can morph into what you're trying to do as an organization. And the way that you do that is to identify the influencers and energizers throughout the company.
Right.
Every organization has these go-to people throughout the company that others turn to, not just for subject matter expertise, but many times for energy. And you have people like this in your life that you turn to them to have great conversations and to bounce ideas off of. And when you leave that conversation, you're pumped up, you feel better about yourself. And then there's the opposite. There are people that you talk to, in the normal course of business, and they kind of suck the life out of you like a Darth Vader, right? And all your energy is gone. We use social network analysis to identify those influencers and energizers. And again, if you ask executives, who are those people in the organization, they're going to think more in terms of hierarchy. They're going to look more at the hierarchical org and think that those are the people that are the influencers and energizers, and they almost always are not. The people that are the true influencers are spread at the lowest levels in your organization. They often fly under the radar. They're not always extroverts. Many times they're introverts, but they have great influence. And when you uncover those people, you now want to make sure that they are bought in to what you're trying to do from a culture change perspective so that they can influence others around you. So in your engineer example, if that same organization had a few key people sprinkled throughout that, that organization, and they were championing using Yammer or using the new tool, I guarantee you everybody else will start to follow suit after a while.
Yeah, that's such an important point, that the kind of influence networks within the company and the dynamics of that are not coterminous with the org chart. That, in other words,
almost never is.
You might be the manager, but you're not the person that people go to about certain decisions. I worked at a change program where we were, it was about salary sacrifice schemes for HR.
Yep.
And we realized that there was a big resistance to the behavior change needed. People just didn't trust the thing. So we worked out who they trusted within their department about things, and those people became the champions. So
Sure.
It's working in a similar way to that.
Very much so. Yep.
Okay. So there's kind of lessons for leadership in that. It's often said that culture starts at the top. What does that actually mean in practice? What are the most important things leaders should be doing daily to reinforce a strong culture?
If leaders don't want the culture to change, then it almost never will. So it is important for this to be leader-led. But just like my last example, it's equally important to have the cooperation at the lowest levels in the organization.
Yeah.
We find that there are, like I said, 18 leadership actions that organizations can take in order to change culture. But in general, leaders have to be highly communicative around what they're trying to do. They've got to describe the why behind the what. Why are we trying to do this?
Yeah.
They should be focused on measurement, making sure that there's very visible signs of progress. And if there's not, where do we need to tackle that going forward? I mentioned transparency earlier, and that was a big commonality amongst those leaders. Yeah. So there's numerous things that I outline in the book that leaders should undertake in order to have successful culture change. And I'm thrilled that we have many Global 1000 organizations, Fortune 500 organizations that are using the book as a blueprint that they're following in order to effectively create a healthier culture.
Okay. So culture isn't just about big leadership decisions. There are also those invisible day-to-day forces that shape how people work and interact. What are some of the most overlooked and underestimated factors to influence workplace culture?
Maybe the most difficult one to deal with is when you have detractors in very powerful roles.
Okay.
And they're not very, it's not very obvious that they're detractors. That's what derails culture change efforts more often than not. And I talked to several CEOs who had successfully changed their culture. That was the hardest thing they had to deal with, is how do I, take these people that are in senior leadership roles, reporting to the CEO oftentimes, but they just don't believe in what we're trying to do from a culture change perspective.
Yeah.
Many of them moved those people out, and shifted the roles. And they said once they did, it was a breath of fresh air. We suddenly could move forward and progress. And I think that's the hard part for a lot of companies, is how do you deal with that? We find that there's a number of companies that resist dealing with the brilliant jerk, the person that is the best salesperson, or the top engineer, or maybe a brilliant marketing mind, and they execute very well, but they leave a trail of disruption in their wake, right? And we all know people like this.
Yeah.
The hardcore companies around culture, they don't let that execution success cloud their judgment around those individuals, because the ends doesn't justify the means, and so they deal with it. Microsoft's a great example. I highlight Microsoft a great deal in the book. I think what they have done and continue to do, frankly, around their culture is something that any organization can follow, but they do not tolerate those brilliant jerks. They deal swiftly with them.
Right. So when it comes to sort of performance, it's not just a matter of, all right, I want the high performers in this company, and everyone else can just leave. You're going to end up with a skewed organization.
That's right.
That way. So you talked a bit about measurement and tangible measures. Culture is often seen as a soft thing that's hard to measure, but you argue that it's trackable. What are the most effective ways to measure cultural?
Yeah, first of all, you can absolutely measure culture, and many organizations are today, which is great to see.
Yeah.
They're often doing it through an index or a dashboard that's made up of several different measures that come into the organization.
Right.
I think a lot of times people just think about an engagement survey and say, oh, is that the culture measurement? And that is not. That's one small piece of data. I argue that oftentimes engagement surveys are poor measures of culture, because it's a point-in-time survey that companies typically do once a year, once every 2 years, and it only gives you, a little bit of data around what's happening at that point in time.
Yeah.
So we see companies measure culture numerous ways. They certainly apply business measures to it. What is our customer success rates, whatever business they might be in, measuring the business results over time. Also measuring things like employee net promoter score. We put a lot of effort into customer net promoter score.
Yeah.
Employee net promoter score can be very insightful, I think, in just seeing how are your employees talking about the organization. What's your employer brand externally? And measuring that over time is what's critical. It's not important to measure your culture versus somebody else's culture. It's important to measure your culture over time. One company that I think does a great job at this is MasterCard. Their CHRO, Michael Ficcaro, has written a wonderful article about how they created a culture index, and they make this visible to many, many people, both inside and outside the organization, to show how their culture is morphing over time. And we've done lots of articles on this and lots of research studies, so you can definitely see those out on the website. But there's numerous metrics that go into this.
Yeah. How about things like newer forms like sentiment analysis, kind of looking at what people are saying on Teams or...
Yeah, I love sentiment analysis, both internally and externally. I think looking at what is being said on your internal social channels is important. It's equally important to look at your, Glassdoor and external
I was
social.
going to mention Glassdoor.
Yeah. So a lot of people cringe when I say that because Glassdoor can be very caustic. It can be more dominated by disgruntled ex-employees.
I've seen board meetings that got completely hung up on a particular negative post on Glassdoor.
Yeah, you can't do that because that'll drive you nuts trying to decipher just one comment on Glassdoor. But what you do want to look for are trends, and if you have enough reviews on there or Indeed or Comparably or any external social site, you can start to spot trends and commonalities across those that I think can be insightful.
Okay, so workplaces are changing fast. AI. Hybrid work, shifting employee expectations. How do you see the concept of culture evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? Difficult at the moment to talk about the next 5 to 10 years. And what should leaders be doing now to future-proof their company culture?
Well, you just highlighted a lot of words that I use many times. So future-proof is a big one. Culture will always be evolving. And so what you want to do is create a culture that is change-ready, one that not only accepts change, but looks at change as an opportunity going forward. That's what the highest performing organizations do. Anytime there are changes in their environment, in their industry, what have you, they will look at how can we exploit that change, and what are the opportunities for us as an organization. It's the companies that have workforces that dread change and hate change. Those are the slow-moving organizations that tend to be the also-rans overall. So I think, as AI is a great example. Certainly AI has already affected organizations immensely, but we've only scratched the surface.
Yeah.
And what our research has shown is the companies that are operationalizing AI today, meaning that they have it both from an efficiency and effectiveness perspective within their organization, they tend to be the higher performing companies. So the strong are getting stronger through AI. The companies that are just in experimental mode or maybe ignoring AI, those are low-performing companies by our measure. And we measure performance by companies that have better revenue growth, market share, profitability over the a 5-year time horizon. So we're constantly measuring this. And a big piece of our cultural advice to companies who want to operationalize AI is make sure your executives are on board. Make sure they understand it. Make sure they're using it, make sure they champion it inside the organization. The organization won't adopt AI if the executives don't really understand it or aren't really using it. So that's a profound shift right now we see in a lot of organizations.
Such an interesting discussion. You're obviously a real expert in change, and we talked a bit about transformation, but are there different categories of change? I mean, how about disruption? When something changes so fundamentally that the whole thing just seems like your basic business model is blown out of the water. Is it an intensification of the same kind of focus that for you, or are there different categories of where you go into crisis mode or something?
Disruption is almost a matter of opinion. I heard this a lot when the internet came around, right?
Yeah.
So, suddenly that was going to completely obliterate certain businesses. But it was the businesses that adapted that became stronger, right?
Yeah.
They used the internet to their advantage. It's the same thing today with AI. The ones that are using it to their advantage are going to become stronger going forward. So I don't put a lot of, a lot of weight behind, is it too disruptive or not? I think there's always going to be disruptions in the environment and, in the industries that you're operating within. Now, there's different types of change. There's process change internally, and how are you, having some innovation around what you're doing from a process perspective. There's change and innovation, what you're doing with your customers externally. I think that the goal here is to not be stagnant, right? I think, there's very few organizations out there that are completely stagnant for a long period of time and are wildly successful, right?
Right.
It just, is a rare thing. It's the companies that are constantly adapting that are going to succeed.
Interesting. So we have to bring this to a close, unfortunately. Very interesting. Thank you for very much taking the time. Lastly, could you just say who on the kind of topics that we talked about, who do you personally follow? Who would you apart from reading your book, what else should people look at and follow and listen to?
I take a lot of learnings from data that is published around culture, and a lot of people publish data in addition to ourselves, but also from the case studies. I love reading about success stories out there. I think that brings that data to life, and there are numerous companies that I think are doing a very good job with their culture. I mentioned Microsoft and MasterCard. If you go back and look at their stock prices of when they decided they were going to really impact their culture, it's night and day from where they are today. They've just tremendously increased the value of the organization. But there's many more examples out there. T-Mobile's another one, which has been one of the greatest turnaround stories in corporate history. And I think we can take learnings from all those case studies out there that any company, whether you're in that industry, small or big, you can apply to your own organization.
Yeah, I'm sure people have learned a lot from this interview that they can apply to their own organization. Thank you very much.
Hopefully. Thanks, John.
Thanks.
If you're looking to connect with the top minds in learning and talent, there's no better place than an iVentiv event. That's IVENTIV. Since 2009, they've hosted nearly 300 interactive conversational events exclusively for senior leaders like global heads of learning. I've been a sponsor myself and found these events invaluable. Less about sitting and listening, more about real, impactful conversations. It's an unmatched opportunity to collaborate with leading chief learning officers on the challenges they're tackling today. Join the conversation. Visit iventiv.com/learninghack. That's iventiv.com/learninghack.
Hack facts.
Kim McMurdo is the Global Head of Organizational Development at Standard Chartered Bank, overseeing leadership capability, team effectiveness, employee voice, and culture activation. With over 17 years in financial services, she's got international experience across Asia, Europe, and the US. Kim is passionate about developing leaders aligned with the bank's purpose. Welcome to the Learning Hack. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you.
You're head of OD at Standard Chartered Bank, 83,000 colleagues in 53 markets, core markets being Asia, Africa, and Middle East. When it comes to learning, organizations have a lot in common, but every business has its specificities. What are the particular challenges for Standard Chartered in your role?
So I would say, akin to a lot of global organizations, there is, I guess, a specific challenge and opportunity of how do we work in a hybrid environment. So we have long, well before the return to office debate, Standard Chartered has been a truly global and hybrid organization working with colleagues in over 50 markets. So I would say, how do you get colleagues learning in a network where those nodes of the network might not even be co-located, I think is an interesting challenge. And I think as a organization that has cross-border as its strategy, so that's our key client value proposition, it's how do we truly have learning that cross borders?
Okay. But a big area of interest for you, I know that came out in the session I saw. It's a really good session, by the way. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Um, is the team as the unit for organizational success rather than the individual. And in this era of hyper-individualism, with the individualism on steroids, actually, lately, with the discourse about performance focusing heavily on individuals, and also technology providing ever more clever ways of personalizing stuff to the individual. And we're all very much into that kind of individually personalized digital experience now, everything kind of focused on the individual. What is this about? Are you a dangerous communist?
I've not been described as that before, but I think whilst of course the value of the individual and individual effectiveness and hyper-personalization to help individuals will of course continue to be important, I think when it comes specifically to the domain of leadership, it's a dead end to only think about the individual in that construct. I think if we look at the size, scale, and shape of the adaptive challenges, even if we just take the interplay between the human and technology, it's, I think, a tad naive to think that that's going to fall down to individual competence of an individual set of leaders. I am much more curious about how do groups, coalitions of leaders come together. And we see this actually both in private and public sector, where actually the need to partner and to work in an ecosystem is much more important than your individual competence within your individual domain, within your individual organizational walls. So yeah, that's why it's not a replacement of individual capacity. I think it's looking beyond individual capability into collective capability.
So not so much about locating your big stars and developing them, but about a constellation
Yes.
of leaders.
Yes. So
Nice way of putting it.
yeah, so thinking how do a collection of bright and starish leaders come together as a unit, and how do they interplay with each other and their skills and their styles and their preferences? That I think is where we can do some leading edge organizational development work.
Right. Do you want to talk a bit more about what you shared in the session with everybody? And there were those 3 points, weren't there? And it's a memory challenge that I'm now struggling. Co-creation was second, I think.
Yeah, so
But what was first?
So the first area was around having big groups of leaders learning together. That was really the first. So social learning, peer learning at scale was really the first area that we talked about that I think is so important. If you are majoring on the collective, not the individual, then don't go do learning in the shadows one-on-one with an executive coach. Do it out loud in big group collectives, I would say was number one. The second, as you say, was if we are going after this more collective style of leadership, then it can't just be the domain of the HR professional that picks the competency from the competency framework. Right? It has to be very much contextual and co-created with the business as well.
Right. And what was the third one again?
With partners. So bringing in partners and clients to thinking about how we are doing leadership development, not as a spectator or not as a provider, but actually in the sandpit with us learning. I think large partnership organizations, a true sense of that or size of that partnership is, are they actually learning together as well?
And when you say partnership, is this partner within internal people in different divisions or different territories, or external partners, or
so both really. I think particularly at the executive end and the senior end, I think there's very little that a CEO can achieve just within the four walls of their organization, right? The need to partner, whether it's with government, non-governmental, whether it's sometimes with competitors, and with suppliers, advisors, etc. So I think bringing more leadership learning closer to the context of this. Yeah, it's an overused word, but I do like the descriptor of an ecosystem rather than functional leadership.
Okay. And within those three things, there were things you located that were tricky and others that were difficult. Tricky is a word that's come up a lot in this day, which is weird. What were the tricky things about the approach?
So I think when we were talking about what's tricky, we were thinking about what's getting in the way of us going after this more collective style of leadership. And I think there was a couple of things that really stood out from the group discussion that we had. The first is assessment. I think in the HR world, we often only assess individual competence and individual personality, individual preference. There isn't really too much work being done on assessing collective or institutional capability. So that was point one. And then the second one that I loved, which is what one of the participants shared, is patience.
Yeah.
So again, in a world where people are quick to try and show their ROI within 6 months of delivery, if we're thinking about developing deep trust with leaders across a network, that's not going to be a kind of instant noodle return on investment.
Yeah. To come back to that thing about assessment, a thing that I didn't actually voice in the session, but it was the back of my mind, probably because it tends to be large organizations that are represented here, and my experience is mostly with startups. But I've worked a lot trying to get sales to work with marketing as a consultant and as a middle manager, which is difficult because they're assessed completely differently.
Completely different.
Salespeople have individual targets.
Yep.
And they live or die by their target and whether they've hit it or whether they haven't. And a lot of them are in sales roles because of their personality profile. That's how they prefer to do it.
Yep.
Marketing people, completely different, very kind of systematically driven and tend to be assessed that way and more collectively assessed, I think, if, the organization's not getting a lot of kind of brand purchase or enough leads, those are types of the measures, but it doesn't tend to be down to that individual target. How do you deal with that? Because it's very often the case that different functions within an organization are assessed differently.
Yep. So I think there's multiple levels of assessment that we're thinking and talking about here. So originally I was thinking more about the competency assessment, right, and the individual, but you're taking it up a level, which is assessment in the broadest sense of how are you rewarded and measured on your performance.
You're going to be here next quarter.
Exactly.
Those salespeople.
And I think looking at those like hard system drivers are so important because quite often when we think about, how do we want to drive collaborative leadership, we think it's all like mindset and behavior, whereas actually, as you're pointing to, it's quite hard wiring in terms of, am I going to get a bonus and am I going to be here next quarter?
Yeah.
So I would say having more conversations around shared goals and shared success and making sure that what you're rewarding is, yes, there will always be an element sometimes of the individual performance in, say, a sales role, but making sure that that's value accretive and not eroding value from somewhere else in the franchise and in the organization is so important in your kind of sales and incentive structures.
Yeah. Is it a matter of changing the way that salespeople, for instance, are assessed or?
Yeah, so I think it's being very careful what you put out into the organization as to what you value, right, and what you pay for, and making sure that it's like that leadership shadow, isn't it? Making sure that if you say in the organization that you value cross-border collaborative leadership, that's what you measure and that's what you prioritize and that's really much what you reward. So that I think it's the cohesion that's as important as to what you pick, that you're reinforcing the same messages through your leadership learning, your selection, your assessment of performance, and then ultimately your reward.
You just reminded me there, I'm hopping around a bit here, but a resonant phrase that stuck out for me was the hierarchy, not the hierarchy. Do you want to explain what that means?
So I can't claim credit for that phraseology. It's a wonderful Professor Tony O'Driscoll who does some of our leadership learning.
Right.
But why it's stuck with me is I think quite often in large organizations, people are adept and skilled at using the hierarchy and using the official kind of command and control style of leadership as to how do you go up, down and sideways in the organization. I think the invitation to use the hierarchy, which is the soft connective tissue of influence, partnership and collaboration, is a slightly messier but much more effective and long-term healthy way of activating leaders. So yeah, we quite often talk about the hierarchy, the invisible knitting together of different leadership systems within the organization.
The sources of kind of influence and even power within an organization aren't necessarily exactly the same as the org chart. There'll be people who are kind of mavens for some particular thing,
Yeah.
and everybody trusts what they say in their advice. And so that's what I mean by the hierarchy.
Yeah, absolutely. And when operating in a hierarchy or when operating in a network or an ecosystem, the role of trust becomes so critical and really important. And I thought it was a wonderful addition by one of the participants to talk about the 3 levels of trust. So the
Yes.
benevolent trust, do I like you? Do I empathize with you? Being kind of the least helpful in a network. Then the kind of capability trust, do I believe that John has the skills to do the job? And
Oh,
then
of course you do, yeah.
being, of course. And then the third level of trust being a dependability trust. So not only do I think you have the skills to do the job, but can I rely on you to get it done? So
Well, not
I
always,
think
yeah.
the role of trust in these kind of systems is so fascinating and important.
Yeah, I think that was Kevin Oakes brought that
Yeah.
up, who I talked to earlier this morning. Another thing that you said that really interested me was that rather than kind of focusing on the top level of leadership in terms of leadership, it's really important to look at the kind of people who are on the way up in the middle in earlier parts of their development as leaders and managers, because that's the way you kind of see change in the organization to carry on in years to come. It's kind of a good long-term view. Perhaps difficult for C-suite to get their heads wrapped around when they're focused around the next quarter. That's quarter sales and the share price tomorrow.
Yeah, I think where I found the C-suite very helpful in that, however, is that I think by nature of making it to the C-suite, these individuals do tend to have an eye on purpose, an eye on legacy, and I think all leaders, when exiting the C-suite, want to feel like they're leaving a kind of positive legacy behind. So I found it quite an easy sell, actually, to suggest to C-suite that actually it's not all about them and it's not all about the top and the executive leadership. It's deeper in the organization. So I think I feel lucky to have worked for an organization that is very empathetic to the leadership mandate all the way in the organization. I think we should focus on all levels of leadership, but very much the next generation. It's a key moment to be working with.
Right. And also not to dismiss people who might be perceived as mediocre, because Kevin was saying that if you make changes at that level, in other words, people who aren't massive star performers, if you can increase their performance by incremental amounts, you can actually have massive effects on the productivity and performance of the organization.
Yeah, and I think this is a big important point into how do you approach leadership development in your organization. I'm sure there's many schools of thoughts, but there's one where there's this kind of like remedial approach where I'm going to take the 10 things that people are defunct in or deficient in and fix them. That's very much not the style that we.
That was going to be my next question, was if you're taking that approach, looking for kind of early stage managers and also those who aren't performing magnificently, how do you stop that feeling like it's remedial, like training for punishment, which very often training is often kind of received and thought of as, oh no, I've got a good training, I must have done something bad.
So I think a couple of things on that. I think one is making sure that you're very much co-creating with your business. What do they need? And it feels like it's you asked, we've given. And the second is making sure that it's not just all about teach, so that you've got peer learning, you've got learning from other leaders. So it's about creating the connection among those leaders as opposed to punishing them. And then I think the third is really being comfortable that it's a multi-skilling strategy. So it's not, I'm going to take these 5 skills and I'm going to move them from A to B on these 5 skills. That will obviously happen, but it's also meeting leaders where they're at and having context-rich leadership development strategies and techniques that are about giving people what's helpful to them at that point in time, as opposed to this prejudged sense that, people are defunct in empathy or whatever it may be.
You shared a paper with me from McKinsey,
Yeah.
found inspiring on leadership. Could you kind of sum up in a nutshell what you really like about that paper?
I really like the fact that the unit of analysis is teams, not individuals, and they had some pretty compelling data on the driver of team effectiveness and overall organizational performance, not coming from the myths of putting your best people in each job.
Yeah.
It's actually about how the best people are sometimes perhaps the right people or the second best person can work within that construct. And I find as HR professionals, if we're working at the enterprise organizational team and individual level. It's the team level where we often don't spend as much time. So yeah, I found it particularly inspiring to say, actually, we're playing a team of teams games. We're not playing an individual game.
So we were talking about peer learning, and this is really a peer learning event. What interests you about what came back as a reaction to your session? Because it's very interactive in this events.
Two things that interested me. One was most of my peers are grappling with this in some way, so we could look at the problem statement, I'd say, relatively coldly almost, and not see it as something that only one organization is struggling with. And I think the second thing I loved in the peer learning was just the long range vision. So the gentleman that we had who shared the 7-year progress that he's been on with his CEO to get to the point where the collective and shared ownership of collective goals is valued. So I think when you're playing a long game and it's a marathon, having sessions like this that you can take encouragement from your peers, I think is super important.
So you've recently been promoted from a role that focused on leadership. Congratulations. How would you look at spreading this team-based approach into leadership across an organization like Standard Chartered? So as opposed to kind of narrowly focusing on leadership, focusing on organizational development across the whole, how would you spread that team-based approach?
So thankfully organization development is now my job title and is now my mandate. So I think it's about flowing to the work and to the moments rather than thinking about taking leadership development out of the flow of work. So one good example in organization development is using strategy activation. So conversations that we're naturally having in our business around how do we accelerate growth and performance in certain parts, and co-opting those to be real moments where we can do big organization development interventions. So that's what I see as a bit of the nuance, is how do we use the team of professionals that I have who are very skilled org development and org psychologists, etc., to support big critical teams, sometimes teams of teams, sometimes agile teams, sometimes leadership teams in the flow of work, I think is the big opportunity that I am excited about.
Wow. We all get very excited about learning in the flow of work. When will it come?
Yeah, I think maybe we're calling it the wrong thing, learning in the flow of work. Maybe it's the flow of work and not trying to bifurcate that learning is something that happens separate from kind of leaning into that natural occurrence of learning within the flow of work.
So lastly, who would you recommend people following on this? I mean, we'll share the McKinsey paper in show notes, but beyond that, who else in your view should executives seek out and listen to in today's crowded media environment for sound judgment and advice on leadership and organization development? You mentioned Simon Sinek and a couple of other names.
So this is maybe not the right answer for the podcast, but I think the reason that I've brought this topic to Eventive and to my network of peers is that I actually don't think there's lots of people talking about this. So I don't have a single person. So obviously I mentioned the McKinsey article, and it's their executive development branch that have been working on that. But I do still feel like, to your point, in this world of hyper individualized, personalized, maybe you can tell me, maybe your readers can tell me who I should be reading, because there isn't a singular voice on this.
Yes, readers, please write in and tell us. Write in sounds like the old days of the 90s.
Stamp on the back of an envelope. Yeah.
Send it on a postcard, but kind of hits up on social media and tell us who you think is good in this area. I mean, it's already new for me. I'm learning today. Every day is a school day.
Exactly.
Especially today. And it's been wonderful to be instructed by yourself. And thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for learning with me.
You're welcome.
Facts.
Terry Jones is the Senior Director of Global Talent and Development at Palo Alto Networks, focusing on talent, learning, and organizational development. Recognized as a thought leader in the HR field, he emphasizes leadership development and employee experience. Terry has previously held senior roles at Chubb, BT, and Google. Hi Terry, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, John.
You've worked in the people function in tech, notably at Google and Palo Alto, and also in finance. I think a lot of us who don't work in the tech sector have this idea that companies like Google or Meta are different in some important way from those in more established sectors. Well, obviously they are. They have a kind of different culture. But they also think that the people are different, but they're completely different species of people, maybe, from the people that HR deals with normally in other sectors. But are they?
It's a great question. I mean, the short answer to that is no. The people aren't different as such. But what is different, I think, is the culture and the leadership in particular. And if I take the culture first of all, all organisations have got their values, which they try to anchor their culture in, and it defines them. Places like Google, Palo Alto Networks that have similar types of values, but the one which always I think is amplified in those types of organisation is disruption or innovation, however it is called.
Yeah.
And I think I think that is the type of value that is lived and breathed, and you see and is encouraged. And because of that, there's a real authenticity that underpins it. When you have everybody in the company, from leaders all the way down, expected to disrupt and innovate, and be themselves and bring their whole selves to work truly, I think that fosters a very different type of mindset and therefore behaviour.
Yeah. We're at a conference where people are constantly mentioning change, actually, over the last couple of days. It's a word that comes up again and again. And kind of a realization that there are different types and grades of change. So you have kind of transformation, and, you have rapid overnight change. Disruption hasn't been mentioned that much, but it is very much a key part of the landscape at the moment when we're recording this. As we all know.
I completely agree.
January, it's been like constant, disruptive, tumultuous change, Is that a function of the companies that you worked in, that are tech companies, and what kind of strains does that impose on HR?
Well, I think to take change first of all, yes, we're in a incredibly uncertain, high VUCA world, aren't we?
And I first heard the term VUCA at a conference here many years ago, about 10 years ago.
Yeah, and obviously the geopolitical landscape translates into the business landscape, translates into the individual functions, certainly within tech organisations, but all organisations, I would imagine, at the moment are having to make decisions constantly based upon the change that is happening around them and some of the things that they can't control as well. So I think when they're sort of synthesizing that into what is it that you can control and change and transform, I think it's really important. And coming back to Google and Palo Alto Networks and other tech firms, I think they've got a certain tolerance already built into the culture for change because of that innovation and disruptive mindset and encouragement. And so, I think I think those organisations are already a sandbox for experimentation and change, and they set up their whole systems, processes, and ways of operating to drive continuous change. So I think there's a great level of resilience and tolerance, certainly in those types of companies.
Do they have a different attitude to things like performance, for instance?
I think, most organisations and sectors that I've worked in, I think, the performance bar is always high. I think, distilling it out of that, you want to look at, obviously what people are achieving, but also how they're doing that. And I do think there's a greater emphasis on the how, because, the way that you collaborate with people, the way that you're inclusive, and that's another defining feature, I think, of those types of companies. Very much that philosophy of the wisdom of crowds, so not believing anybody has a monopoly on wisdom, that actually collectively we can create great and amazing things. I think I think those environments, and Harvard did some research on this, didn't they, and said that 70% of behaviours in organisations is based upon the environment, and that's what also is driving the high performance in organisations. And so I think what you see in some of these tech companies is, let's create the right environment and culture to enable people to come in, do their best work, self-actualize, and therefore perform at a very high level. So I think the level of performance, certainly from what I've seen, is typically very high in most areas. And I think that's quite defining in tech sector as well.
Yeah. One of the things that's driving a lot of change is, and a perception of change to come as well, is AI, of course. A lot of businesses are bringing it in, thinking it'll be a magic bullet for productivity. But how do you make sure that AI isn't just about efficiency, but actually helps people to do more meaningful, high-value work?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? Obviously, AI is it's an omnipresent part of our vocabulary now, and it comes up in majority of conversations, certainly that I have with leaders across the business, with leaders within HR functions. And I think the key principle here is about continuing to lead with humans empowered by the AI, rather than letting the AI overpower or immediately jumping to the AI as a solution. So the best use case is actually that I've seen is where AI is augmenting what people's current work and role is. And so for an HR professional, for example, it could be about the way that we assess performance and identify very targeted and precise interventions, whether that's translating into hiring particular types of skills and people that we need, or whether it's about development and making that a bit more personalized. And so, in that example, it's allowing greater focus and precision and efficiency in order to do that. But I think, it was interesting it is important though for everybody in the company, I think, to have a baseline skill set around AI. And at Palo Alto Networks, we ran a learning series around AI. There was a non-technical series of learning, and there was some technical. And we had a huge amount of employees go through this, and obviously the non-technical was largely around large language model usage for productivity and how people can prompt engineer effectively. But we measured it really, really closely, and what we saw as a result was that there was a 53% increase of people's usage of AI and large language models, either on a daily or weekly basis, as a result of being educated in that space. So you're seeing, a massive tangible impact by educating your workforce on some of these models and using them day to day. And that equated to approximately 40,000 hours of saving for the organization every month.
Wow.
So what that meant, John, was that those people were then able to focus on even higher value work with the use of AI augmenting what they currently do and their existing tasks. So I think that's, the example I would use there as to currently how I'm seeing that we use most effectively.
Yeah, so you're seeing the link there between AI and productivity, not just measuring usage, but the number of hours saved.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Kind of monetary saving. Yeah. What's the first thing HR leaders should be doing right now to make sure that AI is a force for both human potential and business success?
I think one of the first things HR professionals should do is not be fixated by AI and use it as a performance enabler. And it comes back to, I think, what Simon Sinek always talks about, which is the why. That should always be the start point in terms of what's the problem we're trying to solve here. And then having identified that and clearly defined that, look at how we want to do it. And the what is really could be the AI solution, but it could be many other things. And so I think just sometimes reversing our thinking around, okay, this has got to be an AI solution, coming back to some of those basic principles around really why do we need to do something here, and what is the problem that we're trying to solve. So taking a really sort of structured approach to it.
Yeah, thinking about my own usage, obviously I'm a freelancer and been kind of on my own, but it feels like there it's quite a difficult problem in a way initially that, you can go and see Sam, what's his name, in OpenAI talking about use cases for ChatGPT in the latest release and, the kind of upgrades. Yeah. And it'll be things like, wow, you can get this thing to book a ticket for the Super Bowl. I don't want to book a ticket for the Super Bowl. I live in America. And, a list of use cases, I think, well, how does that apply to me? And thinking through what I can actually use it for has been an interesting process and a productive process, but a little bit slow. And even yesterday, I think I learned something somebody told me you could do with it. I thought, oh, bloody hell, I do that every day. Yes, of course I can do that. But that feels to me like the journey. How's it apply to your specific work and your specific role and capabilities and so on? How do you scale an effort like that?
Well, I think scaling anything really comes with real focus and structured implementation. And so the approach I would take, and again, I'll bring it back into the HR world because this is obviously the topic. I think first of all, diagnosing the performance that's needed in the organization is key, is the key start point for implementation with any solution, whether it's AI or otherwise. And then I think identifying, as a result of that diagnosis, the function or business areas that would benefit most from having AI. And it could be something to do with recruitment, it could be to do with onboarding, bringing people into the organization, employee engagement, or learning and development. And then looking at the right solution. So whether that's the ATS for hiring, whether it's a chatbot that's going to bring the organization together and streamline some of those sort of common repetitive requests that people have, or whether it's you're doing predictive analysis, looking at the types of skills for the future and integrating those. And so as a result of that, I think following that sort of process, it enables you to focus then in implementing on the right people, the early adopters. And I think it comes a bit down to the sort of law of diffusion with this, where we'll get to a tipping point across the organizations. And I think the law of diffusion talks about 16 to 18% adoption of something before you get that tipping point. So I would definitely encourage that, go after those early adopters and those areas of the business that also are prepared to collaborate and embrace that type of approach.
Yeah. You mentioned skills there. Skills is probably the number 2 hot topic in L&D, according to Don Taylor. It's wonderful research. This conference in the last couple of days, I've heard a real variety and mix of views about skills and competencies and that whole. What's your beat? What's your stand on it, Harry?
Yeah, we've had some good conversation, haven't we, John? And you've seen it in the room. And I when I step back and I think about performance and what it is that drives high performance, and across any domain, the first principle is really having a clear sight of what it is you're trying to achieve and how you're then going to get there. And so having that sort of North Star, with a framework, which is a guideline really, I think is fundamental to high performance. And I've worked with lots of different and built lots of different, competency models, frameworks, charters, whatever they're called in organizations. And it just gives you a compass as to, where am I now? What does good look like in this role? People are calling them success profiles, talent profiles, all types of fancy words now. But ultimately, it's about here are the core mindsets, competencies, knowledge I need to exhibit to be really good in my role. And I don't think they're static. So I think the frameworks themselves are a guide, but it's a decent start point. And I think if they've got flexibility built into them, what you're able to do then is add the strategic critical skills that you need as a business going forward. Because any assessment you do against those things, John, is just going to be a snapshot in time.
Yeah.
However, it is it's a good start point, and it's in my view worth investing in getting those. Looking at who your high performers are, identifying those key competencies. Because it's the old adage of garbage in, garbage out. If that isn't in a decent place, then, you're not going to get great data. And
The problem with that, though, is it takes time to do it. It can be very costly to kind of assess the skills in your organization and around roles and stuff. And you end up with something which is at least slightly rigid. And we're in an era where, skills needed are changing quite a bit. And jobs disappear, or tasks of work disappear. And then people have to be kind of moved on to something else or sideways. And you need a bit of reskilling and upskilling, which are things people talk about all the time. Are you worried that skills and competencies matrices are things that kind of slightly hold that back?
I'm not if it's dynamic. So I think for me, any system framework that's put in place needs to have flexibility built in from the outset. And so obviously, depending on how you then scale that. One of the notions I've got, which I really want to sort of build out further and implement in organizations, is this idea of a skills dashboard.
Right.
Because this is something which I think is very dynamic and will be able to accommodate any changes that an organization needs around its skills. So just to give you a snapshot of my sort of concept here, I think using AI, we can take a scrape of every individual in the organization's current skill set in terms of what it's doing for its role right now, but also take a scrape of what it is that they've done historically. Because I think there's a huge amount of great skills in organizations and individuals that's underutilized. People have come from different environments, different organizations. They may have done enormous project management, change management work, which they're not currently doing in their role. And, maybe it isn't identified, but we need that type of skill. So I think getting a greater understanding of what is it this person's bringing to the table, what is their package of competencies, if you like. And then having done that scrape, looking at, okay, what do we need as an organization? So we need these things for you right now in your role, but we also need these other things as business critical to drive the organization forward. And then what does that gap look like? And then feed into that the personalized interventions and development paths and activity that the individual needs to do. And that can be a very dynamic thing, because you can keep feeding that type of system once it's created. Because as an organization, if we want to open up different products, services, channels to market, whatever that may be, we can feed that into that system, that ecosystem. And that individual, when they would go into that platform, would see their personalized skills dashboard and see that there is some things that they need to develop in because the organization needs that of them, or that's part of their defined career journey and where they want to go next as well. Right. And they've got automatic linkage to the types of development opportunities that will get them there.
Marvelous. And playing that back towards HR and L&D and people generally, these professionals are going to lead the sort of changes that we've discussed. How do HR professionals need to develop their own skills and stay ahead in that space?
Yeah, I think I think in a number of ways, actually. I do feel when I look at, AI is going to start to take on a lot more of those sort of transactional, repetitive tasks, and that's going to take that away and, enable the HR person, as I've alluded to before, to be more productive and add value in other areas. When I think about the way HR functions are currently structured, you traditionally have an HR business partner or people business partner, depending on what you call that function. And then you'll have your centers of excellence. And I think there's a huge overlap between what the people business partner is doing and the talent development or learning business partner is doing with the business. And I think taking some of those repetitive tasks away, I think those two roles are going to get even closer and overlap and potentially could merge into one going forward. So I think there's some organizational structure implication with the introduction of AI. On a sort of operational level, I think, we've introduced in organizations across the whole employee life cycle now AI. It's, used for sourcing, screening, job description creation in the hiring spaces, as well as creating interview questions you can use for scheduling. You've got AI summaries that can now capture obviously some of the stuff that's going
Talking
on.
about a lot of the stuff I do, yeah.
Yeah. So so this is hugely powerful and enabling performance. I think when I think about sort of leadership, and leadership is key, as we know. It can be up to 70% of what creates the sort of culture and environment for performance, and the influence that it has on the team. I think it will be really important and helpful for leaders to be able to practice things like coaching and feedback, with avatars and using AI in that sense, and role modeling and collaborating as well across the organization better.
Yeah.
So I think there's massive opportunity there. I think overall, the final example I give, and I think that there are many here of usage and the way HR leaders need to sort of up level and raise their game. But I think when we are hiring, developing, there's going to be a greater focus on some of those sort of human-centric skills. So things like, determination and resilience. What is it what thought leadership can people provide from an external perspective, as well, and bring in and sort of develop that curiosity and emotional intelligence. And so I think there'll be a greater focus on some of these things that will give people runway in their career. So I think there's a lot to be done. And just stepping back a second for an HR function, I think the mindset needs to be elevated to think more systemically as a result of this. What are all the moving parts here that need to change to introduce some of these AI solutions in the appropriate places? And that has, again, implications on the culture that's needed. I think we as an HR function also need to role model this. We need to eat our own cooking, and we need to upskill and remain really current on AI, its usage, and that as a result, I think, builds different relationships.
Yeah.
I have recently been working with people analytics, a separate sort of sub-function within HR, and looking very closely at assessing skills, driving performance, where are gaps within individuals, teams, functions, etc. And that's enabling us to be really intentional and deliberate about what we're trying to do, and then measure that relentlessly.
Yeah.
So it becomes a very dynamic ecosystem as well that HR can start to work with.
We're talking of thought leaders to wrap up.
Yeah.
You mentioned Simon Sinek. Are there other people that you follow and look up to for guidance and inspiration?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of other podcasts I listen to regularly.
Apart from the Learning Hack,
of course, the Learning Hack is an essential for any talent learning professional. But two others I think that are really quite insightful and quite different. I have a slight bias on them as well. So first of all, there's a podcast called Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat.
Yeah.
Which is by a gentleman called Bruce Daisley. I used to work with him at Google. He used to run Twitter in Europe, and that's all about it's psychology, behavioral science around trying to create a better workplace.
Yes.
And a more productive, a more performing, a happier workplace, because happy people perform.
Yeah.
So some really interesting guests and things on that one. And also a gentleman called Paul Boros, who runs a podcast called Humorology. It's an award-winning podcast. It's about the application of humor into situations, whether it's diffusing sort of tension, or whether it's just about bringing that into your work day in order to be healthy and obviously great for mental health, etc. as well. But the power of humor in our lives and that sort of chemical happiness that it gives us, I think is unlimited. And so Paul Boros has some incredible guests ranging from politicians through to thought leaders and sports people, business people, etc. And their usage of humor in order to be able to get by in very uncertain world. And we need a bit more humor.
Yeah.
So.
Well, on that happy and humorous note, thank you very much for cheering us all up.
Thank you very much, John. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
The Learning Hack is among the top 5% of shows most listened to globally, according to Listen Notes. And if you think your organisation could benefit from sponsoring the Learning Hack, or from using our knowledge and resources to start your own learning podcast, you can contact me on john@learninghackpodcasts.com. Until next time.
Stay curious, learning people.
Now I finally get it.